by many in the trans community, including academics such as Lynn Conway and Deidre McCloskey, and consumer activists such as Andrea James and others, the Bailey affair was in many ways an open and shut case until the appearance of a preprint in 2007 entitled "The Controversy Surrounding the Man Who Would Be Queen," a case history of the politics of science, identity, and sex in the internet age. Penned by Bailey colleague and intersex researcher Alice Drager, this lengthy apologia for Bailey was published in the Archives of Sexual Behavior in June 2008. Although touted as an objective scholarly history of the Bailey controversy, Drager castigated trans women activists for their attempts at quote-unquote ruining Bailey. She essentially exonerated Bailey of wrongdoing and demonized trans women activists for daring to criticize Bailey's controversial and bizarre views. Her investigation was seen by many in the trans community as nothing but a one-sided hatchet job intended to glorify Dr. Bailey and impugn the hard work of trans activists to expose specious science and transphobic and sexist views. In fact, in that very edition of the ASB, there are 14 peer commentaries which severely critique Drager's work and expose her bias. For many years, the transsexual community was a colonized community. We were colonized by psychiatrists, psychologists, endocrinologists, social workers, academics, surgeons, lawyers, and others in positions of power. Our own voices were rarely heard. Others deigned to speak for us and, often with good intention, defamed, denigrated, and distorted our lives. The emergence of a transgender liberation movement in the 1990s quickly worked to overturn this severe colonization. This was done in multiple ways. Trans people demanded that they were perfectly able to speak for themselves. They challenged the standards of care and the gatekeeping of old guard psychologists who stood in the way of their urgent health care needs. The vast majority of the community opposes the continued pathologization of trans people in the DSM under the diagnosis of so-called gender identity disorder, and are actively lobbying to make sure that it's taken out of the next edition and that people like Kenneth Zucker are called on their transphobic clinical practices. In addition, the community has done pioneering work to advocate on behalf of transgendered youth and have opposed trans reparatist therapies done by people like Zucker and others who attempt to, quote, cure gender variant youth, and have demanded that all people, regardless of age, have the right to freedom of gender expression. More and more trans people have bypassed the overly stringent standards of care by doing things like ordering their hormones on the internet or traveling to more permissive countries like Thailand to get their surgery. Writings, websites, and media productions have poured forth from the trans community which challenge old school ideas about our lives, identities, and complex realities. One could assert that the trans community is currently living in a post-colonial or perhaps neo-colonial era. We have done a tremendous amount of work to liberate ourselves, our lives, and our bodies from the hands of overly bureaucratic imperialists who wrap themselves in academic credentials and science to legitimize their own oppressive missions. However, as is in the case in any post-colonial state, the remnants of colonization still remain. And the old guard, though largely removed through militant and persistent transgendered activism, still white-knuckle it to hold on to their thrones and recapture their power. I believe that this panel is so immensely important because it represents a formerly colonized people speaking truth to power. As an African proverb succinctly states, until the lions come to power, the hunters write the history. Through using our own agency and demanding on the validity of our own lived experiences, we, the lions, are charting our own experiences, decolonizing our own minds, and usurping the power that is rightly our own. The papers that follow are so important because they contribute to the process of decolonization and fight back against the old guard backlash that is so detrimental and insidious to our very lives. Now I'm going to introduce the papers. The first paper is written by Elise Hendrick, independent scholar from Cincinnati, and is entitled Quiet Down There, The Discourse of Academic Freedom as Defensive Hierarchy in the Aftermath of J. Michael Bailey's The Man Who Would Be Queen. In it, Hendrick stakes the claim that challenges to elite monopolies on the power to define the framework of discourse have never been well received. The paper examines Bailey's response to the largely trans criticism of The Man Who Would Be Queen and posits explanations for certain choices he has made in these responses. In examining Bailey's reaction to criticism, the focus is on Bailey's conduct as an attempt to reassert power. The second paper is entitled Go Ask Alice, but Not About Transsexuals' Lives and History, a defense of the rights of members of an oppressed class to speak for themselves, by Katrina C. Rose from the University of Iowa. In this essay, Rose demonstrates the de facto posture of J. Michael Bailey and his defenders. Pro-trans challenges to the conventional historical narrative were met with a robotic unwillingness by the practitioner beneficiaries of that dominant narrative to re-examine its factual underpinnings. Ultimately, the presentation encourages all scholars to not let themselves be bullied by those in dominant positions. The final paper is entitled Fair Comment, Foul Play, Populist Responses to J. Michael Bailey's Exploitative Controversies, and is written by Andrea James of the Gender Media Foundation. In this paper, James shows that the man who would be queen derives from the careerist strategy of academic trolling marketed as science. The paper examines strategies for bringing consequence to academic irresponsibility, the culture clash between online and academic trolling, and the use of offspring as unassailable evidence. The final section examines the eugenic underpinnings and long-term implications of work by J. Michael Bailey and his colleagues. So please join me in welcoming our panelists.